Hi, I'm Cody.
I'm Brent.
And we're the Hugonauts, here to bring you reviews of the best science fiction novels of all time. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to do 3 books at once, and Brent's going to tell us why.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the Vorkosigan Saga, which is a really long series of books, 16 books actually, by Lois McMaster Bujold. Sorry, Lois. But she wrote some amazing books. So we've got 3 of them won the Hugos in 91, 92, and 95. The Vor Game, Barrayar, and Mirror Dance. And all the books in the saga follow this one family, the Vorkosigan family, who's part of the ruling class on this planet Barrayar. They're all really digestible and by sci-fi standards concise, 350 to 600 words, like 11 to 18-hour audiobooks. And it's very loosely episodic, so you can mostly read it in any order. No real imperative to read them in chronological order or anything else like that. Barrayar is this militaristic, feudal, male-dominated society that only rejoined the spacefaring universe a few centuries ago, so they're very backwards, and is the product of its kind of like medieval warring past. And then meanwhile, the broader universe is full of competing empires. There's some lawless planets, there's mercenaries, and then there's wormholes that let you jump from system to system and kind of are the keys to power in space. And so across the generations, the Vorkosigans are the main advisors to the Barrayaran emperors. And they have to use, generally, they're very smart, they're funny, they're very empathetic, and have to use use their intellect to get the empire out of these jams and also slowly push Barrayaran society out of the Dark Ages. So that's the saga.
It sure is. And what do you rate it? What would you rate each? I mean, we're not rating each book here, I guess. We're rating, like, overall. They're all very on a similar kind of plane.
They are. And so just because there's 3 of them, I'm actually going to get a half rating. I hate half ratings, but I'm going to give it 4.5 because I think Barrayar is a 5, and I think the other 2 in the main trilogy are 4s for me. But in general, I love them all. So yeah, I'll give it a 4.5. What about you?
Yeah, I go 4. I think I generally just rate stuff a little bit lower than you. But I also liked Barrayar and Mirror Dance a little bit better than Vor Game, the first one, which I know.
Yeah, it's interesting. We both love Barrayar, and then I like the Vor Game more than you like than Mirror Dance. But yeah. So why? First of all, let's do the obvious. Like, why are we talking about this as a series instead of like doing each individual book like we normally do?
I think it's just makes sense to talk about this as a series because it is a serial. I mean, it's 3 out of 21 books. They all won the Hugo like kind of in quick succession, but we're in the middle of the pack chronologically for when she was releasing them. These are chronologically released, but they're not. They won the Hugo chronologically released, but they're not in chronological order in the series. And there's a ton more books, and they kind of read like serials, right? Like they don't really read as much like individual books. Like sometimes you can pop in on a series and it's just about the universe, about the world, like something like Foundation, maybe. But here it's mostly about the characters. It's kind of like this old school serial or comic book feel, like Sherlock Holmes or James Bond or something like that, where you just really like the character or the characters, and you're reading about like a little adventure they went on or a couple little adventures they went on, rather than this is happening now and 200 years later in the empire of blank, this other thing happened.
Yeah,
not about the setting as much.
Totally agree. Yeah, they're very episodic. I think technically they are a series and not serial, and I think that one is a confusing terminology. But we can leave that to the listeners to correct us on.
Sorry, no, that's they're episodic.
For sure.
It's a series of episodic journeys.
You don't need to watch the James Bond movies in order. You don't need to read Sherlock Holmes in order. Like, this is like that. The characters are amazing. You're going to have so much fun hanging out with them, and it's self-contained every time. So on that note, these characters like are amazing. I think that's both, like, for both of us, that's why we're talking about this. Why did you love them so much, and who are the characters that you really connected with?
Well, obviously you've got Miles, the main character, Miles Vorkosigan, who you aptly put. Who do you compare him? Who do you compare him to?
As I was reading, I was like, man, this is just like Tyrion Lannister, but came first. So I would argue George R. R. Martin ripped off Bujold here, because he's this like, he's a dwarf. He's got like, he had developmental problems from some things that happened in the book that we won't spoil. And he's so damn smart though, and he's very funny, and he's not afraid to like put other people in their place. And so he's just got that like, he's so fun to spend time with. And then he's constantly getting himself into horrible situations that he has to figure out how to get out of. And
it's also a lot of situations, like what makes it fun and more realistic to me, or more human, is that some of the situations are external, but a lot of the situations are also like his own fault.
Oh yeah, for sure. He's too full of himself. And he puts himself. That's right.
Which is interesting. Which is why I think Bujold's writing is interesting, especially in this kind of like the Hugo winning and the sci-fi fantasy space, because she works a lot on like personal development and identity. And so it's like characters like doing something stupid or silly or selfish, and then dealing with the consequences and realizing that and working on it. You just don't see as much, I guess, like intrapersonal development in a lot of science fiction, which is fun to read here, because it is kind of a soft science fiction. We're in the universe, there's these technologies, but we're really not concerned with how they work. It's mostly about the people in the space.
Yeah, for sure. So on that note, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Cordelia. So that's Miles's mother, Cordelia Vorkosigan. And
the
so she's
protagonist of Barrayar.
Exactly, yeah. So Barrayar, the one that we both love the most, she's actually the main character. And so she's a woman, obviously, and she is not from Barrayar, but she met Errol, Miles's father, her husband, who she fell in love with. So she decided to move to Barrayar. But she's from like an equal place, and so she's come into this like male-dominated, totally backwards, like feudalistic society, and she just comes to it with such humor, and she's like a super strong person. She's like putting these shitty men in their place in just like such great ways, and doing this. It's just it's so fun. It's so fun seeing her in action, and like she's also surprising her husband, and like kind of but then he's also. Their relationship is so great. It's like a relationship I aspire to, They're both like... She's
surprising him, but he's supporting her.
Exactly. He's so supportive of her. He clearly wants her to be his partner. He does not want her to be like second fiddle to him. He's like, no, you are my partner. You're my equal. And in many ways, actually, he's like, no, you're clearly better than me. And I'm like, I know it. And it's so fun. She's so fun to spend time with. And seeing her in the role that Bujold generally always has this serious jams. The characters got to think their way out. Like in Barrayar, Cordelia is the one who's doing that. So yeah, it's really she's so fun to spend time with.
Right. And I totally agree. And I also, to Bujold's character writing, we also get, I think what she does really well, and throughout the series and other books she's written, is she really focuses on the characters, which is again kind of rare in the genre. And specifically here with Cordelia, she's created one of the only non-cardboard female roles I've read in science fiction, particularly of the pre-21st century. And I think that what she does with her characters really well is, instead of, she puts them in a society of male domination and power first, militaristic society, and gives them ways to get power without physical strength. So she has these marginalized characters, Miles, who's physically weak and small, who gains power through his cunning and his political guile.
Yeah, and he's like literally looked down upon. They have all this weird political, like they have, I don't know, like racism against people with genetic disorders. And so he, everybody like thinks of him as like a second-class citizen. They call him a mutant. Yeah. And so you're totally right. He's also coming from that place of like, trouble in society.
The marginalia. Yeah. And same with Cordelia. She's a woman in a male-dominated, violence, body power society. And she shows how particularly how empathy can lead to power. Like empathy and understanding others' emotions, and acting on it can lead to respect and power. And so I really, really love that about the two characters, that they're these more nuanced ways that Bujold explores for finding power in those societies.
So what about Mark? So Mirror Dance is an interesting book because it sort of has two main characters. I mean, arguably Mark is more important than Miles in Mirror Dance. So what do you think about Mark Vorkosigan?
And I think he's more featured. He'd be the kind of the third big character to talk about here. Mark is Miles's clone in Mirror Dance, but instead of most cloning subjects that we read, this deals with cloning from like a familial perspective. And the entire time, Miles is trying to find Mark, who's run away from the clone farm that he was raised on, basically. He's raised to infiltrate the Barrayaran government and
to impersonate Miles.
To impersonate Miles and then take it down from the inside. But he rebels against his captors, but he also is running away from Miles and Cordelia.
Yeah, he also hates Miles because Miles is famous in the galaxy for like this crazy ass shit he's constantly doing. And Mark kind of hates him, right? Because he's been like told to be Miles, but he is himself. He knows he's not Miles. Like he didn't do those things. And so he has this he has all this self-doubt and then like loathing for Miles. And that his character arc is really like what Mirror Dance is about and how he kind of becomes his own person. And then also how just like, once again, the Vorkosigan family is so great and accepting and just knows how to give people the space and the opportunities and the chances to either succeed or fail on their own terms. And really that's what we all want. So yeah, I think as we talk about it, honestly, I'm liking Mirror Dance more. It's interesting. As I was reading it, yeah, maybe you're convincing me.
I think it's just it's a really interesting way of looking at cloning, because normally we look at cloning, this stuff we read or see about cloning is this perspective of like, what would you do if there was another you in the world? Like you'd have to kill your doppelganger or they're trying to kill you. And it's always this violence-based thing. And immediately Bujold here is just dealing with identity. Miles and Cordelia are trying to find Mark to bring him in, and Miles calls him his brother, Cordelia, her son, and they're accepting him immediately as a different person and realizing that he is his own person, and they want to bring him into the fold as his own person and let him grow. And he's running away because he's trying to, he has to impersonate his brother or the person he was cloned after. And so he's running away for identity purpose too. And he's struggling to find his own identity. Yeah, it's just a really interesting, again, empathetic way of looking at cloning and how it could, a positive way of looking at it and how it could go. And so probably more realistic, honestly. I mean, if you have two different people in the world, they're not going to be exactly the same person.
That is right. Yeah.
Different experiences.
So one of the other notable things about this book, but mostly notable because it's such a trope, and I want to talk about that, is that once again, we have a medieval feudal society. It's so common in science fiction. I think 3 of the 4 books that we have talked about so far have included it.
Is it common in science fiction, or is it just your favorite and you're recommending me all these books?
No, I think it is common in science fiction. But I also think it's just it's also super common in fantasy.
Of course.
I think that the reason people do it so much is because it lets you, sci-fi, the people who get into sci-fi often want to think about really big ideas, like what's happening across this whole empire, all of space, whatever. But at the end of the day, we're humans, and the way we relate to the world is through human relationships. And so I think the feudal system gets so popular because you can have it's a story about families, but also about the whole universe. And so the way that I think often authors use to do that is oh, okay, cool, what'll be the feudal system? And then I also think it's kind of just a lot of people have done it before, so people keep doing it.
Yeah, it's shrinking the galactic scale of issue into a family or a group of characters, is the microcosm of the galactic struggle. Kind of like it's the same thing we talked about in Dune.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so it's a good structure.
I like it. I also think though it's probably many parts of sci-fi will surely be wrong, but like, if people are going to be smart enough to be spacefaring, I don't think we're going to be dumb enough to like accept feudal rule. So I'm certain this won't happen. But it's interesting to read about, I guess. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
The other thing that I think is really interesting about this book and the way Bujold presents her world is, even though it's a feudal society and like top down and the emperor is in charge, they still all recognize, and she very much recognizes, that changing society is not something that can happen like that. You need to change the minds of the majority of the population. So change is slow. Even when you know that it's right and you want it to change, you can't, even if you're in charge in a top-down society, you can't just snap your fingers and make things happen. It requires that slow, periodic progress of making the world better. And I just love that. I think it's such a good reminder, because especially like right now, I don't know, the world is full of depressing news and it's easy to feel like things are getting worse, not better. But that's not really the case. Things, when you look at large spans of time, things are definitely getting better, but it's just slow. And so it's a nice reminder that like that's the nature of the world and the nature of humanity. And that's not to say we might not have had some backsliding recently, but nevertheless, I think it's like a hopeful message that I think about quite a bit.
Yeah, and you got some good sound design there behind you when you're talking about the world going bad with the sirens.
Did the fire truck go by as I was like, things are dark.
Yeah,
for sure. So,
and that's also one of the themes. That's one of the themes of your novel. Is the slow change of society.
That's true. Well, maybe that's why I like her idea, and I think she's smart, because I also think it's an important idea.
Yeah.
So there's one other thing I wanted to talk about here, which is like, we just said so much great stuff about these books. Why did we not give them 5 stars, I guess is my question.
That's a great question. I think for me, I think it's probably just a personal preference thing. I think 5 stars for me has to be this marriage of the characters being great and doing something and saying something about what it's like to be human and a person, an individual, which she does so well.
Yep.
But then also have ideas of, like, I like harder science fiction. I like talking about like the ideas and the physics of the universe and like what's possible and impossible, and understanding differences in time and relativity of time and the nature of time. I like time stuff a lot. There's just these themes and these grander ideas that I love, and part of what I love about science fiction is exploring those. And she doesn't really do that as much as this is a soft science fiction that is about the characters, and it's just a good setting for them to have some adventures in. So that's probably why it's not 5 stars for me. It's not something that sticks with you, that you think about forever. They're just enjoyable, just really enjoyable.
For sure. Yeah, I would generally say the same thing. Barrayar for me, I think, was just so good that I gave that one a 5. Vor Game, there was sort of an interesting structural thing where it kind of changed. I would argue it really changed a third of the way through, and it sort of felt a little bit jarring. But in general, yeah, I agree with you. I have that same feeling of like the books that stick with me and the stories that stick with me for life. Often, they have to have that character development. But yeah, what's that idea and that thing that you keep coming back to?
I think you had said this earlier, but something like The Matrix, for example, is such a, the idea that it's based on is so worth thinking about, that you find yourself coming back to it outside of the story. Like, what would I do in that situation, or what would I? And there's kind of that lack here of like continued imagination. It's not as fan fictionable. Although ironically, I say that, but there's a ton of Vorkosigan fan fiction, and she's been one of the only authors who's been supportive of fan fiction of her work, because that's kind of how she kind of got her start through that, through writing Sherlock Holmes and other fan fiction, which, surprise, surprise, Sherlock Holmes, but so
is like her work, yeah.
Yeah,
as we talk about it, though, honestly, the more we talk about this, the more I like these books. It's a really interesting thing, because they, as you're reading them, they like feel breezy and easy, and it's like a book you'd read on the beach. And so I think I'm sort of being an elitist. I'm being like, well, that can't be like one of the best ever. But as we talk about it, it's like, oh, actually, like maybe this is like should be higher on my list. It's been interesting to talk about it. So anyway, I love these books. That's so true.
It's I guess you just discredit. It is elitist, right? You're discredit. Yeah. I feel the same way. It's like discrediting it because it's not. We're not searching for the problems. It doesn't take itself
seriously.
Yeah, we're not looking at subatomic particles like we are in Three Body Problem. But Three Body Problem also doesn't have
Three Body Problem has
believable human characters.
Yeah, I can't wait to talk about that one. Three Body Problem is but anyway. Okay, cool. So let's wrap this up. Overall, we really, really like this book. 4.5 stars.
This series, all three books.
All three books, yes. And just generally, Bujold, she's a great writer. Paladin of Souls, also in a Hugo, very, very fun, but we'll come back to that someday. If people liked the Vorkosigan Saga, what else should they be reading?
Well, I feel like this is mostly you here. I had trouble finding things that I felt were similar that were also in the vein. The stuff we compared it to earlier is really what I feel like. Sherlock Holmes. If you like Vorkosigan Saga, you would like Sherlock Holmes. They make sense together.
I would say Robert Heinlein. For me, he strikes me the same way. Like when you pick up a Heinlein book, like you just want to keep turning the pages. The characters are amazing. The dialogue is great. It usually doesn't take itself too seriously. And he's funny. Bujold is really funny too. So I think Heinlein is a really good comparison, and hopefully that makes Bujold feel good. I would not say that there are very many authors in the world who are at all on his level, and I think she's one of them. Canticle for Leibowitz is another one that I like. Similarly, it's funny sci-fi, funny character-driven sci-fi. That one's about nuclear war. There's a little bit more darkness there, but yeah. And then the last one we talked about was Ender's Game, and I think that's because it's like you've got like the very young man, the boy who's like gotta he's like kind of the chosen one. I got to save the world, and super. It's really about the characters.
And just an interjection about Heinlein. She, I would say, is considered the equal of Heinlein since she also has the record for most Hugos, tied with Heinlein. So I would say she's on his level. Yeah,
she has four. He's got 4. I think he has. I thought he had 5.
Oh, well, not including retro Hugos. He beat her out because he got a retro.
Yeah. Okay, for sure.
So I think the people would agree that she's somewhere near his level, and I think it's the fascinating characters. It really that's really what it comes down to here. A 4.25 collectively between us for these 3 books, just because her character writing is so good. It's rare in sci-fi, and each story is really entertaining.
Yeah, and I think these are underrated. One of the reasons we picked these is the people who read them love them. People have read like the entire Vorkosigan Saga, but each book individually has not been read, that much, not like as much as some of the other more, books in the sci-fi canon. So if you haven't read any of the Vorkosigan Saga, please do. It'll be fun. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Later.
Bye.